The idea of converting the Gigant, meaning giant in German, glider into a real aircraft was literally floating in the air. Its implementation was undertaken by a design team under the leadership of engineer Daigle. Since German aircraft engines were increasingly needed for combat aircraft, the technical department issued a task to design a huge transport aircraft in two variants, with 4 or 6 French Gnome engines. The engine was a powerful air-cooled motor with 1,140 horsepower and was produced by a French company in two variants, with left and right propeller rotation. Such engines equipped French block aircraft that fell to the Germans as trophies in the occupied territory of France. An order was received to dismantle the engines from these aircraft and send them complete to the Messerschmitt factory in Leipzig. Since the operating conditions of a high-speed French aircraft and a slow transport aircraft differed, modifications were needed. Thus, the supercharger air intake had to be moved above the cowling, where a characteristic gooseneck appeared. Subsequently, its height and shape changed from series to series, and sometimes from machine to machine. Additional oil radiators were installed under the cowling on extended brackets. The availability of a practically ready power plant greatly facilitated the designer's task, and at the beginning of 1942, work began on equipping serial gliders with engines. When installing engines, it was necessary to strengthen the wing structure, install fuel tanks, mount the engine mount, run engine control wiring inside the wing leading edge, and cover the skin behind the cowlings with sheet metal. The fact is that flame tongues burst from the exhaust pipes, especially during startup, which could damage the plywood skin. In addition, equipment for monitoring and controlling the power plant was installed in the pilot's cabin, and the stabilizer adjustment drive was connected to the hydraulic system that operated from the main engines. The 4-engine version initially received designation C and the 6-engine version D, but later the designations were changed. The first variant had very low thrust-to-weight ratio, and assistance was still needed for takeoff of a loaded aircraft. Apparently, this version was considered as intermediate between a glider and an aircraft. They tried to preserve maximum payload, reduce modifications, and save scarce engines. The prototype of the 4-engine variant initially flew using glider landing gear, but considering the requirement to simplify ground operation, they decided to create full-fledged landing gear. Its design turned out quite successful. Along each side of the fuselage, 5 wheels were placed on lever suspensions. The front 2 had a smaller diameter than the 3 main ones. All of them were covered by a large duralumin fairing. Overall, the landing gear withstood loads well and ensured passability on not the best airfields. The main difference of the 6-engine prototype was, of course, an additional pair of engines. 6 tanks of 890 liters of gasoline each were placed in the wing. Total capacity, 5,340 liters. A novelty was the cabins for 2 mechanics servicing the engines, which were placed in the leading edge of each wing half between the inner engines. Each cabin was connected by a hatch to the pilot's cabin and all engines of its wing half, allowing maintenance directly in flight. The mechanic had instruments for monitoring and controlling the engines of his wing half, as well as firefighting equipment. Improved communication equipment was installed in the pilot's cabin, as well as a number of additional flight and navigation instruments. Compared to its engineless predecessor, the aircraft became noticeably heavier, which led to a reduction in useful load. It turned out to be almost 2 times less than the gliders and amounted to 12,000 kilograms. However, this still allowed delivery of a fairly wide range of cargo, including 1 anti-aircraft gun, a tractor, a truck with cargo, 52 barrels of fuel, as well as 120 to 130 soldiers, or 60 wounded on stretchers. Testing of both prototypes began in March-April 1942. They demonstrated that the 4-engine variant could not fly normally, and it was quickly abandoned. The 6-engine version looked more promising, and without waiting for the completion of tests, a preliminary series of 10 machines was ordered. 6 of them were left at the company's disposal for further testing and modifications, while 4 were transferred to transport squadrons for frontline testing. Their results were deemed satisfactory, and in summer 1942, serial production began, simultaneously curtailing glider construction. French enterprises and the Škoda factory in the Czech city of Pilzen were connected to the existing cooperation. Defensive armament consisted of 4 machine guns, 2 of which were placed in blisters in the upper part of the cargo doors, and 2 more on top of the fuselage. The number of portholes on the sides was reduced, but the possibility of using landing party machine guns was preserved. On this machine, they worked on installing a brake hook similar to that used on carrier aircraft, but this required additional airfield equipment, and the idea did not catch on. The power plant consisted of Gnome-Rhone engines, with cowlings from French aircraft, equipped with 3-blade metal variable pitch propellers. A small batch of Gigants was produced that were equipped with 2-blade wooden fixed-pitch propellers and cowlings from another French aircraft. These cowlings were made according to a special cooling system. On the slow-moving Gigant, this system performed poorly, and engines overheated in flight. Additionally, the 2-blade propeller caused dangerous structural vibrations in some modes. Further development became the D6 variant. It returned again to cowlings from French aircraft and 3-blade variable pitch propellers. Defensive armament was significantly strengthened. An additional turret was installed above the radio operator's cabin, in which 2 more powerful machine guns were mounted, one intended for forward firing and the other backward. Besides the radio operator, a gunner had to be placed in this small cabin. More powerful machine guns were also installed in the cargo door blisters. Overall, this version turned out quite successful and was widely used by the Luftwaffe. At the beginning of 1943, 2 more prototypes were built. The second of them had 4 inline engines of 1,350 horsepower each, but due to their scarcity, preference was given to the 6-engine variant. It was equipped with the same French engines, but cowlings and radiators were refined, and tank capacity was increased to 10,740 liters. Some elements of the glider structure were strengthened, which increased its service life. The accelerator suspension system was removed. The aircraft received additional equipment for flights over the sea, including rescue equipment in case of water landing. Defensive armament was changed again. Since the radio operator's cabin was cramped for 2 people, only the machine gun firing backward was left in it. Machine guns in cargo door blisters were removed. Instead, large flat windows for more powerful machine guns were made in the very nose of these doors, and a special platform was installed for gunners. 2 machine gun installations were mounted on the fuselage sides behind the wing. Thus, the total number of barrels reached 5. A small number of such machines was produced at the Luftschiffbau Zeppelin Company factory. Soon, Messerschmitt presented the next modification of the Gigant. Meeting the wishes of the military, who demanded strengthened defensive armament, a prototype with 2 additional gun installations was built in Leipheim. Each of them was a rotating turret with hydraulic drive, equipped with a 20mm cannon. They were placed on the upper wing surfaces between the middle and outer engine. Flights showed that the turrets created great aerodynamic drag, which significantly reduced the aircraft's flight performance. Therefore, they were replaced with lower turrets with electric drive and the same cannon. Electrical wiring was run to these installations. The wing's structural framework was changed at their placement locations. Emergency hatches were equipped below, and the fabric skin was replaced with plywood, which allowed approaching the turret along the wing during maintenance and protected it from muzzle gases during firing. Machine guns remained in place. These modifications led to further growth in empty aircraft weight and, naturally, to a reduction in cargo weight. which now did not exceed 10,000 kilograms. Nevertheless, the machine was put into series production. The exact number of Gigants of this version could not be determined, but it is known that this aircraft surpassed the previous version in numbers. Considering the large losses of Gigants from enemy fighters, designers from Leipzig decided to create an air cruiser. Unloaded and equipped with powerful armament, it was supposed to escort transport aircraft and protect them from fighters. To test the idea, one aircraft was converted into a weapon carrier. 2 more turrets were added to the existing ones, between the fuselage and inner engines. The cargo doors were sealed, and a rotating turret with a cannon was installed in the very nose. 3 more such cannons were placed on each side of the fuselage. Thus, the number of 20mm barrels reached 11. This arsenal was supplemented by 4 more powerful machine guns, also installed on the sides. Armored glass and armor plates served to protect the gunners. The weapon carrier crew consisted of 17 people, 2 pilots, 12 gunners, a gunner radio operator, and 2 mechanics, with the last 3 also firing during combat. Due to low combat effectiveness, this variant was not put into series production. In late 1942, early 1943, production of the Gigants was gradually transferred to the Zeppelin company. Part of the designers were also transferred there. This was connected with the fact that Messerschmitt turned out to be heavily loaded with fighter production. Subsequently, prototypes created in Friedrichshafen had the index Z. Thus, at the end of 1943, a prototype equipped with 6 inline engines of 1,480 horsepower each was built and tested there. The new engines allowed increasing the aircraft's takeoff weight by almost 4 tons and bringing it to 54 tons. The aircraft was planned for serial production, but due to engine shortage and the Luftwaffe's waning interest in the Gigant, mass production of the machine was never deployed. Another prototype with 6 engines of 1,320 horsepower each remained completely unfinished.
Messerschmitt used the Gigant in a research program dedicated to studying the possibility of dropping a super bomb weighing 17,700 kilograms. This cargo was to be carried by a specially modified aircraft. Since the power of its own engines was insufficient for takeoff and climb to altitude, they had to resort to help from another aircraft. When very little remained to the calculated altitude, the Gigant's crew heard crackling in the tail. Understanding that something terrible was happening, the pilots emergency dropped the cargo. But this did not help. The tail fell off, and the aircraft rushed to the ground. No one aboard managed to survive. The cause of the catastrophe was established quickly. Shortly before the tests, the airfield suffered a raid by American attack aircraft, which damaged the load-bearing tube of the fuselage tail section. This was not noticed before the flight, and in the air it could not withstand the heavy load and broke. Production was completed at the beginning of 1944. By that time, 201 aircraft of all versions had been built. German accounting documents have been preserved, from which it follows that the highest production rate was achieved in February 1943, 27 units, and then they built an average of 8.5 aircraft per month. 2,000 workers were employed in the program. Average labor intensity per aircraft decreased from 40,000 standard hours in 1942 to 12,000 to 15,000 in 1944. The Germans decided to concentrate the aircraft in a special purpose squadron created in 1942, which included 2 groups. Initially, this unit was based directly at the Messerschmitt factory airfield in Leipzig. Then it was transferred to Italy, being used to supply Rommel's Africa Corps. In November, from airfields at Naples, Lecce, Castelvetrano, Pistoia, Gigants began transporting to Tunisia not only fuel, spare parts, food, ammunition, usual for transports of that time, but also light armored vehicles as well as various artillery systems, including 150mm howitzers. On return trips, they delivered empty fuel barrels, spent shell casings, and wounded. As a rule, aircraft flew at low altitudes, singly or in small groups. For example, the crew of Oberleutnant Peter on November 26th transported an 11-ton self-propelled gun from Naples to Bizerte on a Gigant. The flight took almost 2 hours. After unloading and then taking aboard 4 tons of empty barrels, the aircraft set off on the return journey. However, soon after takeoff, the propeller pitch control system of engine number 5 failed, and a fire started on it. They had to urgently return to Bizerte. It proved impossible to fix the malfunction there, and the Gigant again took course for Italy, taking off on 5 engines and without one propeller. An hour later, the aircraft safely landed in Sicily. The Germans gave the aircraft the nickname RAG, or Band-Aid Bomber. Covered with fabric and plywood, it seemed more fire hazardous than the all-metal Ju-52, but in practice, it turned out that the Gigant burned no more often or severely than the Junkers. But repairing it was much simpler. Shooting down a 6-engine transport also proved difficult. For instance, once an American bomber, encountering a lone Gigant, fired all 4,250 rounds from 9 machine guns at it, but could not set the Gigant on fire, and it safely departed. Initially, Allied aviation almost did not interfere with the operation of the German airlift. The first Gigant the Germans lost on November 10th during a British aircraft raid on Tunis airfield. Soon, British aviation burned another Gigant on the ground. On January 11th, 1943, American fighters shot down an aircraft for the first time. Their victim was a machine destroyed north of Bizerte. All 25 people aboard perished. In spring 1943, losses sharply increased. Thus, on April 13, during raids on Tunis and Castelvetrano, the Allies bombed 7 Gigants. On April 22nd, only 16 Gigants proved combat-ready, with which they decided to deliver 198 tons of fuel. But one machine showed a malfunction even during pre-flight preparation, and another had one engine fail soon after takeoff, forcing it to land in Sicily. The rest continued on their way, hugging the water surface to reduce danger when meeting the enemy. However, they could not avoid destruction. 20 British Spitfires and Kitty Hawks dealt with all 14 Gigants. Of the 140 crew members, only 19 managed to survive, with one of them spending 6 hours in the sea before being rescued. After this, flights to Africa ceased, and the squadron was converted to transport. Overall, in less than 5 months, Gigants made over 1,200 flights to Tunisia, delivering about 15,000 tons of cargo, including 96 self-propelled guns and armored personnel carriers, 616 cannons, 360 cargo trucks and tractors, 42 radars. Gigants were also used to evacuate Rommel's Corps from Africa. After receiving small reinforcements, from May 1943, the squadron participated in supplying troops in Corsica and Sardinia. Overall, losses were acceptable. However, on May 20th, Allied fighters intercepted 4 Gigants heading from Naples to Sardinia, and in a brief battle shot down 2 of them, damaged another, which had to make a forced landing, barely reaching the island. In July, aircraft were involved in supporting troops defending Sicily from Allied landings. For example, on July 10th, a pair of Gigants delivered artillery of a paratrooper division to Catania airfield. After Mussolini's regime fell, the Germans decided to occupy Italy. The transport squadron was not left out of this operation. Thus, from July 26 to 28, 6 Gigants, together with other transport aircraft, transferred a paratrooper division from a French base to an Italian one, 25 kilometers from Rome. A month and a half later, these soldiers captured the Eternal City. In autumn, Gigants had to be used to evacuate the Corsican grouping. Peter recalled those days. Our Gigants, against the background of German and Italian aircraft, looked like flying monsters from ancient times. Soldiers shied away from them as much as possible, not wanting to fly on these gigantic birds. On September 30th, fighters shot down 2 Gigants traveling the Corsica-Elba route. These were the last losses of the transport squadron in the Mediterranean. Overall, in this theater of military operations, the Germans lost 83 Gigants, of which 25 were shot down by Allied fighters. After a brief rest, reinforcement with personnel and new aircraft, the squadron was transferred to the Eastern Front, where its main bases became Hungarian and Romanian airfields. From there, Gigants were sent to perform tasks on various sections of the front, from Sevastopol to Riga. Thus, in late 1943, early 1944, aircraft delivered various cargo to troops fighting on the Nikopol bridgehead. From November 1943 to early May 1944, 2 detachments regularly performed flights from Odessa to Sevastopol and back. In particular, in the first half of April, they delivered 30 artillery guns. Overall, by May 1944, Gigants performed about 2,000 sorties on the Eastern Front, transporting almost 18,000 tons of cargo. Since Soviet fighter activity on enemy communications was low, Gigants suffered small losses in the air. Literature mentions only 1 aircraft shot down by Soviet pilots. Gigant crews encountered an unexpected enemy during flights over areas where a Ukrainian partisan division operated. A huge aircraft flying slowly at low altitude presented a good target, and the People's Avengers managed to shoot down 2 such beasts. On August 25th, the transport squadron was disbanded. As a French researcher writes, further use of Gigants was episodic. Most of these aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Some, mainly damaged machines, were captured by advancing troops of anti-Hitler coalition countries. Not one Gigant survived to the war's end in the Luftwaffe. According to available information, the Germans almost never used aircraft for transport in the rear. An exception was the delivery in September 1942 of 12 fuselages for an experimental batch of aircraft from a Polish city to an airfield near Vienna, since final assembly of these machines was conducted at one of the Austrian capital's factories. Gigants played a notable role only in the Mediterranean. In other theaters of military operations, these aircraft found themselves in secondary roles. German soldiers did not like the, quote, rag bomber for its huge size, low speed, unwieldiness, and, as a consequence, vulnerability to enemy fighters. Although defensive armament was constantly strengthened, the lower hemisphere remained uncovered. However, the Gigant had many positive qualities. It surpassed the Luftwaffe's main transport aircraft in payload capacity by 5 times, and in fuel economy by almost 2 times. Simple, accessible materials used in construction made it relatively inexpensive and very repairable. The large door in the nose of the fuselage provided free access to the cargo cabin across its full width and height, which greatly facilitated loading operations. Installation of a second deck noticeably expanded the aircraft's transport capabilities. In literature, the Gigant remains undervalued. Little is written about it, with most authors inclined to focus attention on the machine's shortcomings and high combat losses. Meanwhile, it can boldly be considered the world's first specialized military transport aircraft. It implemented such advanced solutions for its time as a wide fuselage, large front cargo hatch, transformable cargo cabin, and multi-wheel landing gear. All of this is widely used even today.